Sonic is in a bit of a funny spot right now. We're in yet another year where SEGA are marketing the series based on its history. Previously, we saw the Sonic Origins collection and Sonic Colors Ultimate. This year, we're building up to the release of Sonic Cross Shadow Generations, a re-release of Sonic Generations with new levels based around Shadow the Hedgehog. While Sonic Adventure 2 is beloved by Sonic fans and Sonic Heroes is still well regarded in its own right, Sonic Cross Shadow is delving once again to the much maligned Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 and adding Shadow the Hedgehog, the game, to its list of sources for its levels. Couple this with the new story focusing in part on the return of Black Doom, as well as Sonic Origins' inclusion of past Sonic Game Gear titles, and I wonder if there's appetite from SEGA and the Sonic fanbase to explore the more obscure or less well-regarded side of the series. In the past, we had a collection for the more oddball Sonic games. That collection was known as Sonic Gems. The purpose of this collection was to give players access to Sonic CD and some early 3D Sonic games, with a handful of Game Gear games and some more obscure Sega Genesis games. While I hope SEGA continue to make more mainline Sonic games available through re-releases, I also wonder if the Sonic Gems name could be revived to make room for some of the games that are otherwise lower priority. That's what I aim to explore today, so stick around as I build out my idea for Sonic Gems Collection, the Emerald Cut. Firstly, let's get some returning games out of the way. Only 2 are coming back from Sonic Gems proper, and a couple will be brought over from Sonic Mega Collection. The first game on this list is Sonic R, an early 3D racing title that otherwise doesn't get much love. The most appealing parts of this game are its polygonal graphics and upbeat soundtrack. It's not a particularly well-received entry since its controls take some getting used to and the game itself is incredibly short. Still, there's an undeniable charm to this game that makes it worth including in this collection. Next up is Sonic the Fighters. Far and away one of the easiest games to include on this list, Sonic the Fighters digs into Sega's fighting game history and showcases some of the downright gorgeous graphical capabilities of Sega AM2. This game was always a favorite of mine on the original Gems collection. All of the characters still look great with their 3D models, and the game itself is decently challenging and competitive. One thing to note is that, ideally, the version on this new Gems collection is the updated release for Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. The 2012 release made Honey the Cat, a previously scrapped character, finally accessible through legitimate means, as well as letting players use boss characters Metal Sonic and Eggman in multiplayer matches. It would be a shame for these features to remain exclusive to that singular release. Coming in from Sonic Mega Collection, we have 4 games to include. The first is a pretty easy one to justify. Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine is an early Puyo Puyo game with an Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog coat of paint. It tends to show up in Genesis compilations, and it was the basis for an entire boss in Sonic Mania. Next up is Sonic Spinball. I have a bit of a soft spot for this game. It's not a perfect pinball game by any means, but I've always been taken by its grimy charm and less refined soundtrack. Toxic Caves is somewhat permanently etched into my brain. The game itself is a natural extension of Sonic's long relationship with pinball physics and levels, although the screen real estate can sometimes leave much to be desired. In my ideal Just world, this game would receive a full-blown remake that touches up the physics and allows for a more zoomed-out view, but I'll settle for the original being included in this collection. Oh, the things I would do for a Spinball remake. Sonic 3D Blast usually ends up in a lot of Genesis collections, and given its presence in Mega Collection, it's no surprise I would include it here. While not technically 3D, this somewhat clunky isometric platformer does explore some early concepts for moving Sonic in 3D. It even has an early version of the homing attack, albeit as a power-up and not as a base ability. Where Sonic Gem's Emerald Cut should stand out from other compilations is what version of the game is included. Most collections only include the Genesis release, likely due to the ease of emulation. However, it's my preference that 2 versions are included. The Saturn version is often overlooked for re-release despite its updated soundtrack and unique special stages, but in my collection, it's the prominent default version. The Genesis release also makes an appearance in this collection, but perhaps not in the form you'd expect. You see, long after the original retail release, John Burton, one of the game's original programmers, went back and made a director's cut patch that updated the physics, added password save, and allowed the use of Supersonic. There might be some legal oddities involved in seeing this release in an official capacity, but in my opinion it's worth the trouble for making my purely fantasy game compilation the best it can be. Our final returning game is Flicky. There's not a lot to note about this game. You've likely seen and forgotten about it dozens of times, but this cute little arcade platformer has an undeniable charm to it. Most people wouldn't miss it if it weren't included, but I think this game still deserves a little love. Alright, it's time for the new games in this collection, and we're gonna start with a pretty obvious one. The Sonic the Hedgehog arcade game, known as SEGA Sonic, was reportedly supposed to be included in the original Gems collection, but was ultimately left out due to difficulties translating the trackball controls to an analog stick. We're nearly 2 decades removed from that original compilation, so I think programmers for this iteration should be able to figure something out. This game is the origin of both Mighty the Armadillo and Ray the Flying Squirrel, and hopefully their inclusion in Mania Plus has left a desire to see more of them. Given that SEGA Sonic has never seen a release outside of its limited arcade run, this is easily a front-of-the-box selling point like Sonic CD and Sonic the Fighters were for the original Gems collection. The game itself is a fun romp with charming and expressive sprite work. It's probably some of the best pixel art Sonic has ever had. Next on the docket is Knuckles Chaotix. This 32X game has never seen a re-release, and there's good reason for it. In addition to being made for expansion hardware that few people bought, it's not all that great as an entry in the classic Sonic lineup. The notable points are the music, which is included in Sonic Origins, as well as being the origin game for the Chaotix. The game features a mechanic that links the player character to the computer player or second player at all times. It's an interesting extension of Tails' mechanics from Sonic 2 and 3, but the resulting rubber band physics do take some getting used to. I doubt people will come away from the experience having found a new favorite game, but I do think the game at least deserves a chance to be seen and experienced. Okay, alright, I'm gonna rip the band-aid off now and talk about my most controversial pick. I think Sonic Shuffle should be in this collection. I know, it's not a great game. Believe me, I know, I recorded the gameplay footage you're watching now. I want to remind you that my goal with this collection is to explore the weird and otherwise forgotten parts of Sonic's history, and this one attempt at a party game sure is weird and forgotten. Sonic R was included in the original Gems collection, and it didn't suddenly become a critical darling either. I don't want Sonic Shuffle to be realized as an overlooked masterpiece. I just want to make sure that even the rougher games are made accessible to a wider audience. Okay, now that my hottest take is out of the way, perhaps my other 2 Sonic picks will go down a bit easier. Sonic Pinball Party is the other Sonic pinball game. The engine is more refined than Sonic Spinball, although the screen crunch hasn't gotten much better. The pinball takes place on themed tables as opposed to grimy levels within Eggman's Fortress. There's a story mode, a collection of party games, and even the tiny Chow Garden. I definitely prefer Spinball's personality to this game, but the better engine and extra modes make this a worthwhile pinball game. Alright, the final Sonic game I'm including is Sonic Battle. If Pinball Party is the other pinball game, Battle is the other fighting game. This one has a more refined control scheme to fit the Game Boy Advance's limited buttons, but ambitiously places the fighting action in a pseudo 3D space. It's not the most balanced of games, but it does have a pretty expansive story and contains some of the only existing sprite work for modern characters like Rouge and Shadow. There's some decent depth to the limited control scheme and some mini-games to explore when you want a break from the story. The original Sonic Gems also included some non-Sonic games in the mix. You've already gotten a taste of that on this list with Flicky and, to an extent, Mean Bean Machine, but I have just a couple more that I want to include. First, we've got Rad Mobile. This is one game in a line of Sega's fairly extensive arcade racing history, and it hasn't gotten a lot of re-release attention. It's got some great sprite work and somewhat unique mechanics for turning on wipers and headlights, but if I'm being honest, the real reason I'm including this is because it's technically Sonic's first video game appearance. You can see him swinging back and forth from the rearview mirror. Dynamite Ducks is loosely connected to the Sonic series because of one character, Bean the Dynamite. Yup, that Dynamite Duck takes some design inspiration from Dynamite Ducks. What a shocker indeed. On its own merits, the game is a reasonably competent beat-em-up game. I had trouble recording the arcade release, so you're seeing footage from the Master System port, but obviously I'd prefer the arcade version make its way over. All of the other non-Sonic games in this collection have at least some connection to Sonic, but this next one has no connection whatsoever. Panzer Dragoon Mini is an obscure game for the Game Gear, and it was only ever released in Japan. We've somewhat recently gotten a remake of the original Panzer Dragoon, and we might see more of those down the line, but there are never going to be plans to make this one available. Mini is a fairly easy shooter game and an interesting footnote in the histories of the Game Gear and Panzer Dragoon. I've put it in this collection because, realistically, being a filler game in a compilation title is the only real shot it has at a re-release. For my 15th and final title in this collection, I've chosen Nights into Dreams. Nights often crosses over with Sonic, usually as a pinball table or on a billboard, but beyond that crossover connection, Nights is just an amazing game. It has such a fluid and charming flight system, as well as a stunning soundtrack. It's the reason the Sega Saturn needed an analog controller. Nights is probably one of my favorite games of all time, and I would love for it to reach more people through this collection. So, those are the 15 games included in the Emerald Cut. I could probably have bloated the list with even more Genesis or Game Gear titles, but I don't feel that would be in the spirit of the Gems collection. There are other Sonic games that have been notably absent, like the Advance or Rush games, but those are probably best saved for their own collections, and might already be on Sega's mind. One noteworthy omission I want to directly address is Rystar. If you know your Sonic trivia, then you know Rystar was born from one of the scrapped concepts when Sega were trying to determine what Sonic would be before he ultimately became Sonic. I went back and forth on whether it should be included in the Emerald Cut, but ultimately I decided against it. The reason is because I think Rystar should instead be given his own remake. I don't think Rystar is likely to become a tentpole franchise, but he does at least deserve a touch-up on par with Alex Kidd and Wonder Boy. One other point to note is that most of the games on this list have a significant multiplayer element to them. While facilitating local multiplayer is a given for this kind of collection, I would also hope to see online multiplayer as a consideration for the Emerald Cut. Maybe that would be a little too much to ask though. I doubt most of the games beyond Sonic the Fighters would develop a significant enough online scene to warrant the server costs, but a girl can dream. So this is where my sequel to Sonic Gems collection stands. 15 games with 6 returning from previous collections, 2 versions of one of the included games, and 9 games new to this collection that dive into Sonic and Sega's history. But what do you think? Would you buy this collection? Did I miss any important games? Are you secretly a Sonic Shuffle fan?